So welcome back, everyone, and welcome back, Alessandra, for a fascinating session. As you've just said, you're going to finish off your presentation, and then we'll move into the workshop style where we're looking at actionable things that people can actually bring into their workforce. Thank you.
So the last area that I just wanted to look at before we have a discussion about what this all means and what you can be doing is the Hillsborough Law. Now, actually, it was back in the news yesterday, so you may have seen it. As very recently. Effectively, the Hillsborough Law will bring a duty of candour across the public sector. That's the idea. It already exists in the NHS. So in the NHS, if a doctor makes a mistake that results in could have resulted in harm or did result in harm to a patient, they're under a duty to say and to tell the patient, the duty of candour. And that's been the case for a number of years now. So say you had a baby and the delivery didn't go as expected and there was an adverse outcome or could have been an adverse outcome, you will be or should be invited to a meeting when you're well enough to talk about what went wrong, and you should have an apology offered. And that is now the norm in the NHS, or at least it should be. And what the idea is that candour, that openness, that transparency, that admission of a liability, of fault, effectively, would come across the public service more generally as a result of it's called the Hillsborough Law, but it's as a result of a variety of big problems big events that have gone on where it's been felt there's been a lack of transparency. Some of the other ones being the infected blood inquiry, which I'm sure you will have all seen as well, where it was known for an extremely long time that was a problem with the blood products that were being handed out. And nobody, not only did they not say something at the time, but then when it became apparent that people were becoming severely unwell, nobody then said anything at that point either. So not just, it's called the Hillsborough Law, but it's as a result of a variety of really serious issues that have gone on. What will that mean for you as employers? So for those managing the workforce and supporting on the workforce, it will be instilling, as I'm sure you've been trying to already, a sense of needing to speak up when things have gone wrong, but creating a culture in which people feel that they can do that without effectively putting their hand up to ask to be disciplined or put through a performance procedure. How do you balance, on the one hand, an open culture of reporting and learning with on the other hand, sometimes you do have to have formal processes to deal with what people have done. So that will be an interesting one. And for those involved in litigation, how do you balance defending your, the organisation against claims and, mindful of public sector money and so on, but with the need to be transparent? Because if you admit that something's gone wrong, are you admitting liability? And obviously that will be a question of fact and degree, but something which our team that deal with clinical negligence claims, for example, come up against very regularly. So whilst it will be new for the public sector, it will not be new for other aspects of the public sector. It's not a new thing. So there'll be areas from the NHS in particular that local government can learn from about how effectively to implement a duty of candour, how a duty of candour meeting would work, how you engage with people, and what information you should give, how you give it and so on, and how you balance that with litigation. So there's already a precedent, but I think for it would be about working through your ICB potentially with your NHS partners in your local area to learn from how they run the duty of candour. And I think that'd be your best starting point for how you implement it into your own practice. I've talked a lot now for this morning. As you can probably tell, I've got a bit of a cold, so my voice is going slightly. So I'm definitely going to now hand over to some other people for some some ideas. So we've got some significant changes. The first bit that I think is going to be a big change will be if they remove entirely the requirement for, and I'm just going to stop sharing my slides so I can see people when they put in the chat and put their hand up. Is going to be the big change is going to be around how do you effectively onboard new members of staff, determine if they have the right skills and experience for the role, manage them effectively if they have a day one right to claim unfair dismissal. Now, there is sort of a murmur about there being a probation period point to it, but I don't think it will be so far as to say, well, it's now a 6-month sort of period of service that you can dismiss in, because they've been very clear it will be a day one right to claim unfair dismissal. But I just wondered if anybody had any thoughts about how that's going to impact on their service in terms of how you encourage managers to make early decisions. I mean, one thought that I had, and I'd be interested for people's thoughts on this, is that the shorter you make the period for managers to make a decision about whether someone is working at the standard they require, the harsher they're going to be. Because if they know they've only got 6 months, they'll make the decision in 6 months. Whereas if they had a bit longer, they might give someone the benefit of the doubt. It might end up having a reverse effect. But I don't know if anybody, has any observations they might want to share about how they think that's going to work in their workforce.
Can I kick off? Can I kick off? Everyone allow me to kick off, if that's okay? I know I shouldn't be kicking off and should be allowing for the floor. I think I'd like to inject a little bit of honesty from my colleagues in the room. I have worked in several local authorities, and I think from my experience, local government actually find that 6-month probationary period quite difficult to manage. It's not very consistent in most local authorities. So I think there's some work to be done in local government in any event in terms of assessing the suitability of a person coming new into role. They may do that better for particular types of roles, apprenticeships, trainees, because there is probably a little bit more structure around that. But what I think I found in my experience is that local government have struggled to be consistent and mindful around probationary. Either they are perfunctory, tick box, or they are very inconsistent in terms of managing probationary periods. So I think it's not just being mindful now around the fact that there's unfair dismissal. It's probably our local government colleagues having to actually go back and think, are we doing our probationary periods? Are they doing justice to what we're trying to achieve here in getting the right people in for the right role? So, and I also think then that there is something about ensuring that you're selecting right at the first time. So this is, so you're sort of, are you clear around why you're appointing someone in terms of skills, matched to the skills, the roles, qualifications, accountability, doing your due diligence in the first place, but sometimes gets overlooked, I think, in local government. But hey, that's just my view. I do think if we were really honest, how many times have we dealt with as HR and OD professionals, the mistakes of senior managers employing people who they haven't really paid enough attention to their suitability of somebody to a role. So that's my view. I think we've got to do wholesale look at the recruitment process, not just look at part around the unfair dismissal come early. I think we need to probably go back and look at the entire process.
And I think that's an excellent point because, as you say, a poor recruitment decision can be, well, not just difficult to deal with, but hugely expensive, especially if you've used an agency, or you know, the management time and the HR time that gets pulled in to deal with it. So, you know, I think that's, you know, as a sort of outcome number one is how can we look back at how we recruit and get the best candidate for the role through the door, so that hopefully the times when you need to use a probation period to end somebody's employment become a rarity rather than something that is needed quite regularly. But I mean, if it makes you feel any better, the probation, you know, the probation period, I don't think it's well implemented across the public sector more generally. I don't think that that's a local government thing. I think probation is something that lots of people, you know, managers are busy ultimately, and also they want to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think there's a bit of that to start with as well. I think the other bit that I'd just be interested for people's thoughts are in that, obviously as public service, you'll be keen to promote inclusivity and bringing on, in particular, people with disability, maybe lived experience as well into certain areas of your services. And actually for those people, 6 months may not be enough time to show you what they can do, because they may need more support, and it may take you a bit of time to get the adjustments in place to enable people to show you what they can do. I just wondered if people had any thoughts about how, or if and how they might need to review how they onboard staff with health conditions as well, so that they get people in the best place to have the level playing field from the outset. I don't know if anybody wants to contribute on that.
And whilst they do, we've got Sarah Billington, who's said, will this new change include people who are about to join the organisation within the next few weeks? That's her question. And Sharon is asking, is saying, and I absolutely agree with her, as part of the recruitment process, the induction of an individual into an organisation is just as important as part of the process of recruitment. It's important to retention. And it's important for the person who really, sometimes people are very good about choosing for themselves whether they've come into the right organisation, aren't they? They deselecting themselves when they realise, hold on a minute, I'm being inducted here and this isn't the job I thought it was going to be, and make their own choices. And that's what induction can do if it's done properly, as well as a positive thing in terms of ensuring that people are clear about what's expected of them in the organisation and how to navigate an organisation as how people do business in that organisation. But what's your thoughts around Sarah Billington's question, which is, will this apply to people who are about to join in the next few weeks? Or have we got some more time to go?
I don't think so, because I think that I think there will be well, they've said there'll be an announcement and we're expecting it imminently. So we're in the next week or 2 or 3 weeks, but they will need to, legislation can't act retrospectively. So I think that what it would probably be, it will be from recruitments that take place where people start an employment at some future date that they specify. I'm expecting it to be a date relatively soon. It won't be like 3 years' time, but potentially, for example, as somebody said previously, it might be from April next year or something like that. So I'm expecting it to be not that much time to get yourself in order for it, but not tomorrow, if you mean.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, on the issue around people with disabilities and their right as everybody else under this new legislation in terms of unfair dismissal. I mean, what it shouldn't preclude then is the disability discrimination laws around reasonable adjustments, as you're saying. So those things will still apply. So my expectation would be that if you're doing probation or induction and recruitment for a person with a disability, that reasonable adjustments should apply in any event. It's not nothing new. You should be doing that in any event, shouldn't you?
We should, but what I often see is that, you know, someone needs, I don't know, adaptive software or chair or whatever they need. and it doesn't come until month 4 or 5 of the probation period. And so really, can you effectively judge someone's performance when you haven't provided them with what they needed for the first part of the probation period? So for me, it's about, for reasonable adjustments, it's about getting what you need to do in quicker and at the outset of the
Yeah,
period.
definitely. I mean,
Otherwise,
induction doesn't have to start day one, doesn't it? The induction could start before somebody's actually landed into, physically landed into the organization. I think some people think it's very linear, that you can only start induction once actually somebody's, they're on the payroll, but actually you can start induction before someone arrives.
yeah, particularly around getting those plans in, and flexible working, I think, would go along with that. We talked about the hybrid. I think digging out those issues before people start is helpful, because ultimately, if someone's coming expecting that they're allowed to work from home 5 days a week, and that's 100% not what you're going to allow, it is making sure that you've dug out those issues before people actually start, and then you've got the proper, before you make the offer, ideally, of employment, and being really clear what the expectations are, and that they can request flexible working, but what the policy is, what the hybrid working policy is, what the expectation is, and so on. Yeah. Does
Any
anybody
more
else?
questions from the floor around the changes around day one rights and how they think that might impact their organization and what changes they're planning to make? So we've got Balbir, sorry, who's asking, do we ask potential applicants to share any RA needs as part of the recruitment process, but is it challenging to get this information prior to the appointment decision?
So you're not allowed to ask health-based questions, say, for the purposes of what they need for interview, until after you've made a conditional offer. But you can make the conditional offer, and most people will be coming from another job, so we'll have a notice period. So it's not like they're coming tomorrow, and you need to do, your reference checks, and often there will be a DBS check, and all that takes time. But I think it's about getting on with it so that the occupational health referral, whatever your mechanism is for establishing support that people need, doesn't come too late in the recruitment process, that effectively they're now looking to start and you've only just realised that they need, they use a wheelchair or whatever, and they need to be on the ground floor, as simplistic as that. So I think it's about how you sequence your onboarding process to give yourself time to get everything in place for people to show you their best, their best work from day one, as everybody else does. But I think as well, it's about making sure managers don't revert to harsher decisions, but potentially because of this change as well. And I think managing that could become interesting.
It just prompts me to think. I know that Nicola's on the call and Sandra's on this session. I mean, and I know, for instance, both Nicola and Sandra's organisations have a very open culture around accessibility and having people in the organisation that have differing needs. And if you are promoting that and advertising that as part of your process, and people are more likely to be confident to disclose. So it's not just, I think, as you say, doing it more upstream. It's also encouraging people to disclose. So, and if you are going to do that, then I think you probably need to be looking at your employee value proposition, as both of their organisations have done, where it's very, very clear that this is something that is not out of the ordinary, it's part of the ordinary. And we want people from all different backgrounds, and including being an inclusive and accessible employer as well. That would also help. Sarah again is asking, do we have a disability? We have a disability passport once someone is in our employment. We can accommodate people with disabilities. A passport is open to existing employees should they become disabled or need temporary adjustment following illness, which is a good action, disability passport, I think. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah.
Yeah, and I would encourage that to be promoted earlier, if you I'm sure you do, but early in the recruitment process, to encourage people to tell you as soon as possible what they need, so that you have the time to get that in place effectively. Because some stuff you do have to order in, you don't have, they're expensive. Adapted chairs can be north of £1,000. You're not just going to have them there in case somebody needs one. You'll order it when you need it, because some of this stuff is expensive. But it's making sure you've got the time to inbuild to make sure that they have that when they arrive. Not, as I say, what I often see is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months after they start, that's when the equipment starts to arrive. And then quite often, unfortunately, what's already happened is a kind of breakdown between the manager and the employee as to whether it's working out for them. But you then provide the adjustments. Can you really realign people's thoughts and mentalities in that relationship where perhaps it's not gone well so far, but maybe it was or wasn't because of the adjustments? That's, I think, when it can become a little tricky. Does anybody else have anything? I mean, I think we need to see the detail of what this probation period is going to be. I think for anybody that's thinking about removing probation periods, I would say pause, because you might just be removing something you need to put back in. And in terms of your probation, if you're reviewing your probation policy, again, you may want to pause, because there's, it might be superseded by what's coming in. But I think as soon as that comes in, I would very much encourage all of you to look at your your inception, your job advert, how you reach the right people right through the recruitment, as Pam said, how you get the right people through the door, and how you really get your managers engaged in that probation period, to help you make the best decisions and get the right workforce.
If even if someone has the right to claim unfair dismissal from day one, it does not mean that you don't have a right as an employer to bring about a fair dismissal for the right reasons. So I just think that we just don't want to throw the baby out.
No. If somebody's not up to the job, you
Yeah.
can dismiss them. But what you'll need is more evidence
Yes.
than you probably would need previously, and a proper full process. Whereas lots of employers' probation policies will be quite a short form process. You might need a longer one, and you might need a full. They might, your full disciplinary policy may apply. Again, that's another area where I think you'll need to look at, because my experience, and again, I'm not picking on the local government sector here, but I think it is endemic in public sector processes. They're often extremely long. And so you start a disciplinary process, and 4 or 5 months later, we're only just reaching the end of it. So it's about how you, particularly if someone's right at the start of their employment and it's not going well, and their behavior or whatever is not good enough, is how we really cut through that and just nip it in the bud, how we run our process effectively, so we don't get tied up in a process we don't really need, that the law doesn't require, but we kind of get stuck in a policy on it. So it's about having a look at your policies overall, I think, because they may well apply in this early period.
So I think overall, on everything that you said, there is probably a view that we should be reviewing all of our policies and procedures to make sure that they're fit for purpose, and they're actually doing what they're intending to do, and they're actually workable. I think sometimes, people have done those reviews and time has passed and they haven't, if this is the time for you to do the review of them, fair enough. Because you've had 2, 3, 4 years since you've last looked at them. If you're in the middle of doing the review, then you're fortunate, because then you can use the upcoming changes to help shape them. But actually, how effective are they is probably the hardest test, because we often have policies and procedures that actually, when people start using them, they're either found to be cumbersome or not workable, because of sometimes them going round and round in circles. So yeah, totally agree with that.
Yeah. Does anybody else have anything on that bit? Or I thought I might look at the proposals around the change to single status of worker, ending of 0 hours, and those kind
Just
of
one
changes.
last question, sort of related. Sharon McMahon is asking, what are your thoughts on mandatory training for making a selection decision? Would that be helpful?
So I certainly think that anybody that's involved in recruitment as a minimum should have equality, diversity, inclusion training specific to recruitment. So not just what is the Equality Act and what is direct discrimination, but I would say further than that to say everybody has a level of unconscious bias. How, as a recruiter, do you recognise that you probably do have a bias? Because it's unconscious, you may not know where it sits and you may not know how it comes out. But how do you, in a recruitment process, recognise your behaviours when you are starting to lean into a bias? Sort of, we did a really interesting, I've just done recruitment training myself because I recruit people to work at Capsticks. Sort of, things like the horns and the halos effect, where you see something you like in somebody and then everything they do is wonderful. They do something that annoys you and then everything is everything's not good. How do you stop recruiting in your own image? You start an interview and you get on really well with the person and you think, I could have a coffee with that person outside of work. They're really fun. I could see it. How do you stop recruiting because they're a nice person? Those kinds of things about how you address the unconscious bias. So I would say, for me, the recruitment training needs to go beyond knowing what the Equality Act is and into how does human behaviour get in the way of making a good recruitment decision.
Totally agree. Okay, shall we move on to some other areas of the legislation for discussion? Where would you like to go?
So unless anybody has a particular one that I know there was some questions on candor. I don't know if people would like to go back to candor or the other one I was looking.
I just snuck in a sneaky one there on candor in the chat when you were just finishing off your session, asking about its impact on public liability, indemnity, and consultants indemnity. It just everything that I am looking at the moment, you just keep on thinking about post office, and you've got a third party supplier doing work for you, like in the post office, and actually look how much damage it's done. And we often in our sector have third parties working for us, don't we? So I just snuck that into the chat.
And I think that will become an issue because ultimately, if you employ them to do, I don't know, if you have agency staff that come in to fill some gaps in your social care service and you have a Winterbourne view type, abuse scenario, then potentially you are going to be liable for your agents. It's going to depend on, but also sometimes in these things, reputation, it sort of doesn't matter what the legal contracting position is. You're the council providing that service, whether you employ the person or whether you've contracted somebody to do it. In the public eye, it will be your fault that it's happened. It'll be on your watch. So I think the candor proposition will really bring that into focus. I'd say in the employment context as well, though, I think candor is something that we've been encouraging clients to think about now over the last few years. So if you look at some of you might have seen the Michelle Cox case, the lady that brought the claim against NHS England, and that some of the commentary comes out of there that there was and I'm not saying this is the commentary, but the reluctance to admit that racism has happened in your own organisation, and that if you do recognise that in a grievance process, are you inherently then leaving yourself open to a claim? But I think I would counter that to say, if you think that somebody has been discriminated against because of race, pregnancy, whatever it is, and that's your opinion in your internal process, why wouldn't you make that finding and deal with it then and there, rather than try and sort of sidestep it and potentially just deal with it in a claim in a public forum instead, when then you come under criticism because your own internal process failed to deal with it. So I think we're very much encouraging employers now to think, if somebody says, I think the only reason I haven't been promoted is because of my, I don't know, Southeast Asian heritage, or because I've took maternity leave last year, or because whatever the reason is, that you grasp that allegation and you make a finding on it. And if you think it is because they had a baby, then it's incumbent on you as an employer to deal with it internally. Waiting for the claim to come, I'm not sure particularly helps anybody, and you can see how that's played out in the Michelle Cox case. So that kind of thing, I think, comes into your grievance process as well as managers. So it's not just about you having candor about what you have personally done. It's about you as managers and as HR supports, encouraging managers to, when they review things, have candor about what they think has happened and being confident to make those difficult findings.
Can candor then end up have somebody as an individual being found wanting or guilty of not displaying candor in a particular issue? So we're familiar, aren't we, around how corporate manslaughter can work, or an individual in a tribunal being named. I'm just thinking, does this legislation end up in the same way, that an individual can be found not to have had candor
Like the
in their
duty.
dealings?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I say, the best template we've got from this is the NHS, who've had duty of candor for a long time now. And yeah, it's not uncommon for me to see in disciplinary terms for a doctor that they failed in their duty of candor. So that not only did they not treat a patient properly, there was errors made, but then they weren't open and honest when they realised that they'd made a mistake. And sometimes actually, if they just owned up to it in the first place, there wouldn't have been a formal process, but the lack of candor is why they're in the formal process. So yeah, and it'll be about building that duty of candor into your policies. So not just, as I say, about the duty of candor as you as an individual to say what you think you might have done, but also the duty of candor as managers and HR supporting on processes.
To disclose what others may have done as well.
And make findings where findings need to be made. So I think it comes out in a few different ways. And it'll be, I think for HR, it will be helping and empowering managers to make those difficult decisions.
Yeah. So we come back then to training, management training and induction, and also the review of our codes of conduct and our disciplinary procedures and sanctions, isn't it, as a result of this one? I think there's some actionable points to have a look at if we haven't already done so, because of course there are probably people on this call where they've already incorporated that, but this feels like something that should be explicit.
Yeah, and I think yesterday, Sir Keir Starmer said that the Hillsborough Law would be one of the first things to come. So we're expecting that very soon to come in. I mean, I think there will be, the duty of candor is coming in, maybe the 1st of April, but I think it will be soon. And far-reaching, I think.
Any other questions on this particular issue from the floor before we can move on to, because I think it'd be good to have a conversation about hire and fire and rehire.
Yeah, so that I was just going to finish off, if nobody has any questions on candor, with the sort of the changes that they're proposing to make around the flexibility of the work. I think perhaps if I put it like that. So the fire and rehire, the change to potentially only one status, you're either self-employed or you're employed, and the changes to 0 hours contracts, and how you think as employers, how much you think that will affect your workforce, how much that's going to bother you, how much you use workers, how much you use 0 hours, and if you do, how do you think you're going to remodel to comply with potentially not being able to use that in future. I don't know if anybody has any observations on that.
There must be people out there who are thinking about the 0-hour contracts and fire and rehire legislation changes. I know I definitely am, but I don't want to go first again. I'm hogging the floor. My own personal questions with you, Alessandra. There must be, I think, organisations that are thinking about that. Most of local government now are on looking at organisational change. And organisational change obviously also touches the workforce. Workforce changes, that often means restructures, reorganizations, looking at people into new roles or voluntary and compulsory redundancies. And this issue around fire and rehire is quite pertinent in that case. Oh, we've got Caroline Block.
Hi there. Hi. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find my hand to put up.
No worries.
Yes, apologies for that. Yeah, no, I mean, we hire a number of sessions. We don't call it 0-hour contract, because clearly that doesn't sit well in public sector world, but we call them sessionals. And of course, over the many years, sessionals, whether they work in health or in education, they are a core part actually of our work. And so and we know from experience that over the years they acquire regular patterns of work, and when it comes to restructures and so on, and we're looking to reorganize that work team, that they will qualify for they have potentially redundancy payments and so on because of their patterns of work. And I can't see that arrangement changing, to be frank. I think it is something, as I say, that we don't use the term 0-hour contract, but in practice that's pretty much what they are. So it would just be useful, given that it is quite a significant pool of staff, how we might sort of revisit some of those issues there.
Yeah, and I think the difficult bit with some of the sessional workers is you can't have them self-employed, because you need a greater degree of control over them than you can have over a self-employed person, because of the nature of their work that they do. And I'm thinking, in particular, those that work, some of my clients have people that work sort of in mental health settings and so on, that sort of thing, where you can't have people substituting who turns up, and you can't genuinely have a self-employed, because you need the person that you've asked to come and do the work. So there needs to be an element of personal service to it. I think we'll need to see the detail of what they're proposing on the single status of worker. But I agree with you that very quickly you'll need to do an audit. And actually there's the preparation, doing an audit of your workforce to say who is employed, who is genuinely self-employed, and who's in the middle, so that when this legislation comes through, where do we need to concentrate our focus to, if we need to, normalise their working relationships to the new legislative position, one way, employed, or the other way, self-employed. And if we are going to go down the self-employed route, is that feasible? Is that workable from a governance position, from an insurance position, from all of those really important aspects for service delivery? Can we make them and because often these people don't want to be employed. I come back to that point. They don't want to be. So there was an interesting one that came out of the NHS. I don't know if you saw the Moon decision on the NHS, where they have these it's a legal requirement to have these allied health service managers that are supposed to be like an independent critical friend of how services run and so on for people with mental health conditions. And the idea is they're supposed to be independent from the trust, because they're supposed to play a kind of critical friend monitoring type role. So they don't want them to be employed because that completely erodes it. But they've been found to be workers, which is then potentially going to push them into employees if we have one or the other. But then it completely goes against the whole point of why they are not employed in the first place, which is they're supposed to be a bit like a non-exec. They're supposed to have that degree of autonomy from the organisation to play their role effectively. So it'll be roles like that where we'll have to think carefully about how that is structured and work with the new system to make it work. But I think if it's just gap filling, maybe you end up going back to it. And that's the other thing. Maybe you go back to an agency model and the extra cost and so on. That's the other way to do it for some of these people. But I think that the starting block is you need to know who is affected. So who's in that middle space?
Thank you.
And actually, should they be in that middle space? So an opportunity now to say, well, we might have started with them as sessional workers, but they're in reality not. And do we just bite the bullet and normalise that now? Or do we wait for legislation and see which way we want to go?
Wise advice, Alessandra, wise advice.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Caroline. We are nearing the end of this session. The time has just flown by. And, there was another question in the chat. I've got millions of questions. Might have to send them to you separately. But it's been absolutely fascinating. We knew it was coming with this change in government, this administration. So it's not as if we were not aware that this would have been one of the things that they wanted to bring on pretty quickly. How alert we are to it and how prepared we are is a different issue, isn't it? So thank you so much for bringing this to our attention and giving us some of the detail that maybe some of us might have overlooked or not had enough information about. It's been absolutely riveting. Thank you really for your time today as well, and thank you participants for your questions. We will, I think, get your slides, won't we, that we can share with the participants afterwards, and that will be a good aid memoir. But once again, thank you very much for your time today, Alessandra.
You're inviting me. Thank you. It's been good to talk to everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day.